Back in July of 2020, this camera was announced alongside the Canon R5, and I thought to myself, hey, this camera seems pretty underrated considering the fact that it does almost exactly the same things as the Canon R5. Most people don't actually need those things from the Canon R5. This camera seems to be a pretty underrated camera, plus it's actually priced really well. I thought to myself that this camera is a pretty good camera to use long term, and I would love to own it one day. It didn't make sense at that time, especially considering the fact that I wasn't doing photography and videography full-time or even making a business out of it. That all has kind of changed because now I do photography and videography as a side business. So getting this camera was sort of a dream come true because previously I'd been using Canon Rebel cameras as well as the M100, which is they're good cameras, but they're no R6. Thought I'd give you some of my thoughts as a person who has been using this camera for about half a year right now, and see how it fits within the ecosystem today. Please note that when I make videos like these, or pretty much any video that I make, they are based off personal experience and my personal opinion in the way I work and what I do. So the pros and cons might look like that to me, but they might not be the same for you because there are some features that I maybe don't need, or some cons that maybe just don't bother me, and there might be some pros that I see as pros that you might not care for. Also note that there's no universal code to tell you that okay, this way of working is good for every single person. Obviously everyone's workflow is different, so do take that into account. Do your own research, don't just take my word for it as a random stranger on the internet. So I'm actually going to start with the cons of the camera that I found because there are not many of them, so I kind of just want to get them out of the way. The first really obvious thing would be the overheating. Now I know Canon's come up with a couple of firmware updates to rectify this issue, but I live in Malaysia, it's a really hot country, and I still get overheat warnings and stuff, and I would prefer to not have to worry about the overheating of this camera. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's just something that I have to keep in the back of my mind, so it is important to mention. So next thing I don't like about this is when you want to switch to the high frame rate options. Basically, if you want to shoot 120 frames a second or 100 frames a second, you kind of have to go into your menu and then click on an extra option to enable high frame rate options, and then then you can select only the high frame rate options, which it's such a waste for me because I have to keep going into that menu system and then getting into that frame rate, and when I want to switch back out I have to go and disable that high frame rate option again, and then after that choose my frame rate again. I wish they had a simpler menu to just go pick your quality and then pick your frame rate options, and then and then just shoot. Then that would solve a lot of issues. A way that this is fixed on the other Canon cameras is because they have custom functions for videos, which is my other complaint, is because I don't have the option for custom functions for video on this. There's only custom functions for photography, and I'm okay with having the custom functions for photography, but I wish they had it for video as well, because they would be just as useful, if not even more useful actually, just because the switching is a little bit difficult. Again, that menu system could be improved. I don't think they're gonna update that. I don't think they're gonna fix any of these things. It's still the same in the newer cameras as well, so I guess that's just something I gotta learn to live with. Now the remaining of the cons is honestly just stuff that I don't really care about that much, but I know it's worth mentioning just because it's pretty obvious that some of you might actually run into this issue. Firstly, the lack of third-party support for the RF mount. I know everyone's really frustrated about the situation, but I don't really feel affected just because I don't use those third-party lenses for the RF native mount. I have EF lenses that I still use on this camera. I think that it's made to be a little bit more of an issue than it actually is, because honestly I use EF lenses on this camera and they still work perfectly. They feel like they're just native lenses. I used EF L glass, I even use Sigma adapted EF lenses, and they all work fine, nothing wrong with them. If you're looking to buy the third-party lenses which are cheaper and good quality and probably having a different range that you're looking for, then go for another system. This is not worth your time. Next up is the micro HDMI port. I think a lot of people have been complaining about the micro HDMI port, but a lot of people are always considering these camera options without even thinking that they might not ever even use the micro HDMI port. So I don't really use this HDMI port at all, so it doesn't bother me. I don't even have a micro HDMI cable. so it's not a con to me. So if that applies to you, just get a different system, man. It's really not worth it. And the last thing is that everyone's complaining about the IBIS wobble on this camera when you're shooting wide at like 60mm, and I can tell you I don't shoot at 60mm. The widest I usually go is about 24mm, and I find that the wobble isn't really present when you're holding it properly. If you're vlogging, I think I could see how that could be an issue, but I'm usually behind the camera, so I've never actually encountered this issue. That's about it for the cons of the camera to me for my workflow. So now if you own this camera and you find a lot of these cons, you're using a wrong camera. Just get another one, get a different camera. This doesn't get in the way of my work, it's doing whatever I need it to do, hence the short cons list. Now for the pros of this camera, the autofocusing system in this is superb. Like, it's so good. I thought the M100 was good when I first got it because that was the first implementation of dual pixel autofocus. I was like using it and I was like, oh, this is so good, it's so quick. And then I got the Canon RP and I thought to myself, oh, this autofocus system it's even faster. I'm getting a 98% hit rate. And now that I have this camera, it takes it up another notch. I can't even find a photo that's out of focus. If I check out my library right now of photos, I can't find a single one that's out of focus from this camera. Now if you're doing wildlife or sports or any of these like high-paced photography settings, you might see an issue there. In my use case, shooting portraits, events, the occasional landscape and street photography, I have never had a missed shot. I don't think I can remember one right now. Next up, I wanted to talk about the IBIS in this camera. Now I know I had this in the cons part of the list just because a lot of people have been complaining about the wobble, which I personally don't really have that much experience in, but I do want to put in the pros just because it has been such a lifesaver for me in the video side of things. I like the fact that I can almost get rid of the tripod and gimbals out of my setup just because if I need a quick shot which is like super static, I can just hold it and it's almost just perfectly static. So the fact that I could get rid of these two big things in my setup, I consider it to be a really good feature in the camera. Next up, I want to talk about C-Log 3. I know it's not everyone's favorite log profile, and I also know that a lot of cameras nowadays have like log profiles, even the really tiny cameras from Sony and all, but I personally come from not shooting log to finally shooting log, and I have seen the greener part of the grass. Not shooting in log, you're missing out on so much, and I never realized that until I did. So yeah, shooting logs changed a lot. It also helps in dynamic range. And speaking of dynamic range, the dynamic range in this camera is pretty decent. Coming from someone who shoots a lot of film, this is nowhere near film, but it's still good enough. Like the latitude is enough for you to do what you need to do most of the time. So yeah, it's a pretty good range, good enough for me. Again, not perfect, but it will do the job. Next up is the ergonomics. I don't think you understand how this camera actually feels until you actually hold it, because it actually feels perfect in the hand. I know some people have bigger hands and they find this a little bit small, but for my hand size specifically, it's perfect. It literally feels like it's part of my hand. Even with adapted lenses, with these big EFL lenses, I still don't feel like it's a big hindrance. Like, I still feel like it's comfortable, it's nice. Good job, Canon, for always giving us that perfect feeling camera body. Now speaking of the camera body, the buttons and dials have been really useful for me. I have pretty much mapped out every single thing to a custom function here. I love the fact that it has 3 separate dials that I can control ISO, shutter speed, as well as aperture. Apart from that, having the ability to map the shutter button to start and stop recording for video is also really useful, because it's just really nice to press this instead of this. I don't like reaching my index finger around like that. I think that's not a single button that I don't want to reach for in this camera, which is really nice. All except for this record button up here, which I don't really care. I don't use that record button for anything. Next up, the lens mount. Now the RF lens mount is such a great mount for me. I know a lot of people talk about the third-party lenses and stuff. I mean, like, if it affects you, it affects you. It doesn't affect me. Now I shoot a lot of like vintage lenses as well. I have some Canon FD glass, and I love the fact that I can just adapt these to this mount without any optics in between them. And this is nice to mention because that's why I chose mirrorless cameras over DSLRs anyway. It's mainly because of this mirrorless mount that I could just adapt seamlessly and use a spacer instead of using something that could potentially make your image less pleasing and all, because you're putting a cheap glass in between them. The burst rate, it's a really fast camera in general. You barely outrun the buffer unless you're a lunatic who just holds down for like, I don't know, a good 5 seconds or something. I love the fact that it has 2 card slots. I don't always use 2 cards. I only use it when I'm working. When it's personal stuff, I tend to just use one of them. You can also record video to both cards simultaneously, so that is very nice. The low light ability of this camera, it's pretty good. It's not Sony a7S III good, but it's pretty good. A lot of people tend to think that because this is 20 megapixels, the low light capabilities of this camera should blow the R5 out of water. But based on my experience using the R5 and the R6, I don't think there's much difference in terms of like the low light ability. The R5 is just as capable as this R6. Finally, before I wrap up this entire video, I do want to talk about the fact that the R6 Mark II has been released, the successor of this camera right here. Now what I think about that camera is that it is, compared to this camera, it's better in every way, and it should be because it is a successor. However, if I don't have this right now, I might still get this instead of that R6 Mark II. Now with the release of the Mark II, the prices of this have gone down significantly. And I'm not talking about buying it new, I'm talking about buying it used. In the used market, these cameras are going for ridiculous prices. So if you're thinking of getting a camera like the R6 Mark II, I tell you to go check what it is in the R6 Mark II that you want that you can't have in this. If you can't live without it, sure, go for the R6 Mark II. If you can, and you think that this can serve pretty much all the purposes that you need it to, get this camera. It's still a really good camera now in 2023. You're still going to be able to produce great images, it still has great video functions. Everything about this camera is still great. The R6 Mark II does the same thing, just does it better. So if you're willing to buy used, this is actually a really good option. Now to wrap up this video, I just think that overall this camera has been one of my favorite cameras ever, if not my favorite, and it's gonna be staying with me for a really long time. Probably not gonna change this anytime soon. So that's pretty much it. Comment down below if you have any questions about this camera. If you want to share your experience about this camera as well, feel free to do so. Like this video if you found it helpful. I'm gonna be putting out a couple of videos with this, comparing this to film, so if you're interested in that, feel free to subscribe. Lastly, feel free to check out my Instagram if you want to see some more sample photos from this camera. Usually I have them like meticulously named, so it's pretty easy to find out which camera I'm using for what. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.